What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Every once in a while, a single technical adjustment exposes more about a system than years of speeches ever could. Not a battlefield breakthrough, not a dramatic announcement, just a quiet switch flipped somewhere deep inside the server room, and that's it. That's exactly what happened when Starlink announced devices that now they have so-called white lists, restricting access to Ukrainian authorized terminals and leaving unauthorized users suddenly staring at a dead signal. Russian pro-war bloggers did not just complain, they unraveled. Because what vanished overnight was not convenience, it was the invisible glue holding together a massive overstretched war effort. Units went silent, drone guidance vanished, coordination dissolved into confusion, and all of it revealed a truth the Kremlin desperately wanted just to stay hidden. A military, basically, that loves to threaten the world that had built its daily operations on borrowed technology and blind hope. So today, let's unpack how this happened, why it took so long, what it exposes about Russian planning, and which grave mistakes Putin might be forced to make in the near future. The reaction alone told you everything you just needed to know. The moment access restrictions went live, Russian frontline chatter turned into a panic. Not anger at a tactical setback, not frustration at a temporary outage, but a genuine disbelief. The kind that happens when you realize the floor beneath you was never solid to begin with. Because for years, unauthorized Starlink terminals quietly powered field coordination, drone navigation, and unit-to-unit communication, pretty much every single thing that modern military relies upon. And it relied not as a backup, but as an actual backbone. And that for a country that prides itself distancing from everything Western-made. When access disappeared, entire sections of the front lines were effectively deaf and blind at the same time. But you know what? This was not supposed to happen. The unspoken assumption was that nothing ever would. These devices were smuggled, accounts masked, registrations routed through third countries using VPNs, all these IT shenanigans and everything, and payments zigzag through layers of plausible deniability. It worked long enough for complacency to set in, and once complacency takes hold, temporary solutions stop feeling temporary. They become doctrine by accident. That is precisely how a modern army ends up depending on a foreign commercial system it neither controls nor officially acknowledges. The sudden silence did not just disrupt coordination, it shattered a myth. The myth that improvisation equals resilience. But improvisation works when you're bridging a gap. It fails when you build your entire structure on top of it. Russian units discovered they were not losing an auxiliary tool. They were losing the only system that tied their operations together in real time. And as confusion spread, one question started hovering in the background. How did Ukraine solve these problems so clearly and so fast? To understand that, we need to look at who was sitting on the other side of the switch, who flipped it, and that pretty much takes us directly to the architect behind the move. But first, a very quick word about the upcoming holidays. Let's be honest, most wallets are stuck in the past, bulky, slow, overstuffed, and somehow always impossible to use with just one hand. This is where Exter comes in, the company that created the most convenient and sleek wallets and still makes some of the smartest everyday gear out there. The Exter Cardholder Pro is all about speed and control. With a single click, your cards fan out instantly. No digging, no fumbling, no awkward pauses at the checkout. It is built from durable aluminum, designed to protect your cards from bending, skimming, and daily abuse, while staying slim enough to just actually disappear in your pocket and you just literally forget it's there. And if your iPhone, the Cardholder Pro MagSafe takes it even further. Snap it straight onto your phone, detach when you need it. Zero bulk, zero compromise, effective, very easy to do. It's a wallet that actually adapts to how people live now. And right now, guys, it is the perfect time to upgrade. Exter's Valentine's Day sale is live, with up to 45% off until February 25th. And if you use my code DUDE20, you unlock an extra 20% off on top of the sale. Yes, on top. Plus, Exter backs everything with a 100-day money-back guarantee. Try it, use it, live with it. And if it's not for you, just that's it, send it back, zero risk. So if you're still carrying a wallet that feels 10 years behind, well, it might be time to upgrade. Check the link in the description, which is partner.extra.com/Russian, or scan the QR code you see right now on the screen. Don't forget about the code DUE20 for extra discount. Thanks so much Extra for sponsoring this video, and now back to the program. Thank you guys so much for watching promotions, they really help channel a lot. Now let's continue. What made this moment so striking with the Starlink deactivation was not just the effect, but the elegance of the solution. No messy shutdowns, no collateral disruption. Ukrainian systems stayed online. Unauthorized access vanished. That kind of precision does not come from panic or improvisation. It comes from understanding how large technological ecosystems actually function. And that is where Ukraine's leadership choice quietly paid off. Unlike traditional defense officials shaped by doctrine and hierarchy, the new defense minister came from the world of digital systems. Someone who understands access control, authentication layers, and how scalable platforms are actually secured. Someone who does not see technology as a black box, but as a series of levers waiting to be pulled correctly. The problem was not mysterious. Russian forces were using hardware they were not entitled to. Simple as that. And so the solution obviously was not dramatic, it was once again obvious. And that difference is what matters. A conventional military mind might see communications as hardware only, radios, satellites, antennas. But an IT-native mindset sees permissions, credentials, and authorization. Instead of trying to block signals across entire regions, the fix was targeted at identity itself. Devices that belong stay connected. Devices that did not simply stopped working. This also explains why it took some time. Not because the issue was unknown, but because the solution required trust, coordination, and technical confidence. And you just don't make this move unless you're certain it will not backfire on your own forces. And once that possibility was taken care of, the implementation was almost boringly smooth and routine. And boredom is exactly what scares systems built on shortcuts. What is more revealing is what this episode says about the other side. A military that invested hundreds of billions annually never bothered to build redundancy into its most critical layer. It gambled that this access would never be revoked, that no one would notice, that no one would care. Well, that gamble just failed. And the failure does not stop at communications. It exposes a pattern that stretches far beyond one technology, which leads us to a deeper and far more uncomfortable realization that, guys, we need to talk about in the next chapter. When you zoom out, the Starlink shock stops being surprising. It becomes inevitable. Because this is not an isolated miscalculation. It's the same pattern repeated again and again. A gap appears, somebody finds a workaround. The workaround works just well enough, and just instead of fixing the gap, the workaround becomes the policy. And once it is policy, questioning it becomes disloyal. Sounds familiar, right? This is how military with tanks, jets, and strategic weapons ends up coordinating modern operations through smuggled consumer technology. Not because alternatives do not exist in theory, but because building real systems takes time, honesty, and accountability. Three things that the current structure avoids at all costs. Of course, it's just easier to pretend a patch is permanent than to admit that the foundation was never poured. And you see the same logic everywhere. When armored vehicles proved vulnerable, improvised defenses appeared overnight. When those stopped working, mobility replaced protection. When standard equipment ran out, anything that moved became acceptable. Each fix was celebrated as ingenuity. None were treated as warnings. The absence of a long-term plan was not hidden. It was normalized. And that normalization has consequences. A force that reacts instead of planning does not pursue objectives. It chases opportunities. Whatever worked yesterday becomes tomorrow's strategy. A temporary advantage becomes a sacred doctrine. That is how communications, logistics, and coordination all drifted into a single point of failure without anyone daring to say it out loud. The Starlink shutdown did not collapse the front lines, not yet at least. And that is the most, if you think about it, disturbing part. The system was not designed to win efficiently. It was designed to continue indefinitely. Even degraded operations still produce movement. Even poor coordination still generates pressure. As long as replacements keep arriving, the mechanism grinds on. Which raises a troubling question. If borrowed systems can disappear overnight, then what replaces them? The answer that might be being proposed may be even more dangerous, just a grave mistake if anything else remains unchanged. And that is exactly what we'll talk about in our final chapter. When one dependency vanishes, pride demands a replacement. And in this case, the replacement being whispered about comes wrapped in symbolism rather than performance. Well, typical Kremlin stuff. Russia does have a domestic satellite navigation system called GLONASS. On paper, it promises independence. Well, in practice, it represents everything that went wrong with previous approach, condensed in just one very expensive illusion. Years of funding have flowed into it. Enormous sums, hundreds of billions of dollars, not even rubles. Enough to build something world-class if the goal was reliability. But when projects exist primarily to absorb budgets rather than to deliver results, well, guess what? Outcomes follow incentives. Precision suffers, stability wavers, latency grows. These are not abstract technical flaws. They are fatal limitations in a modern coordination, where seconds matter and accuracy defines whether you survive or not. A country that is willing to spend billions to improve by a fraction of a percentage point will win. A country that wastes billions just so Putin's friends buy yachts and mansions will not. I mean, a country. I guess, well, you all know which one I'm talking about, right? Well, yet this alternative, GLONASS, has at least one good thing for the Kremlin going. Symbolism, once again. It sounds sovereign, it feels defiant, and that makes it irresistible to advisors whose primary skill is telling leadership exactly what it wants to hear. No one eager to keep their position will admit that a patriotic replacement may underperform the very system it is meant to replace. Especially when admitting that would mean acknowledging years of corruption, of your own corruption as well. And then there is another risk hiding beneath the surface. Systems built without transparency tend to be fragile, and fragile systems attract attention. Anything rushed into service for symbolic reasons rather than operational readiness becomes a target. Not immediately, not publicly, but eventually. Especially when its architecture is known and its weaknesses are quietly noted both by the enemies and the friends. If this alternative is forced into widespread use, it will not fail all at once. It will fail unevenly, inconsistently, just enough to cause confusion. And confusion is worse than absence, because absence forces adaptation. You kinda try to do something. But false reliability breeds complacency. That is the real danger. And it is a danger being actively encouraged by a culture that confuses loyalty with optimism. This looming grave decision whether to implement GLONASS or not is not just technical, it's philosophical as well. It asks whether leadership is willing to hear uncomfortable truths or prefer comforting illusions. And history suggests which answer usually wins. The Starlink switch did not end anything, it revealed everything. It showed that the war presented as methodical and inevitable is, in reality, held together by improvisation and denial. It exposed a system more interested in appearing strong than being actually resilient. And it highlighted the difference between planning for outcomes and planning for continuation. Losing access to a borrowed network did not stop operations. It just made them louder, clumsier, and more expensive. And in a structure where persistence matters more than precision, that is acceptable. That is the uncomfortable truth. This conflict is not optimized for resolution. It is optimized for endurance, for motion without direction, for fixes without foundation, for doing for the sake of doing. What comes next may look patriotic. It may sound sovereign, but it is built on the same incentives that produces this dependency in the first place. And so guess what? It will deliver the same result. Another stopgap, another illusion, another day where everything seems fine until the signal drops again. And when it does, when inevitably it does, the reaction will be the same. Shock, outrage, accusations, shifting blame. And not a single moment of reflection about how it all became so fragile in the first place. Well, there you have it, guys. Thank you so much, Extra, for sponsoring this video. Please don't forget to use the link down below or scan the QR code you see on the screen. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to my channel. Happy weekends. Thanks so much. See you on Tuesday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe